Good afternoon, all. Welcome back after lunch. As Rob mentioned earlier, we've got the best of the best here, and for me, I think I'm pretty lucky. I've got the presentation where we're talking about the success stories. So essentially, of the best, this is the best of the best of the best. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ben Well. He is the Global Road Safety Manager at WRI. And he's going to be talking about reflecting on WRI's work to advance the safe systems approach in Colombia, Brazil, Ethiopia, and India. Welcome to the stage.
Good afternoon. Can you all, there we go, okay. Well, welcome back everyone from lunch. I will try not to lull you into a nap for the rest of the panel. And I didn't bring a presentation today because I just have a few minutes. I know there's a lot of people on the panel, and in the spirit of actually keeping people awake, try to move it along and keep it active. I also know that this morning Claudia gave, and Sergio gave a good overview of what WRI has been doing on advancing what we call the safe system approach, and others call the safe system approach to road safety, of which Vision Zero is a part of. And they've talked about the framework that we've put forward that is about these key principles, which include things like humans make errors, we're fallible, that the human body can only sustain so much force, that we need to be proactive rather than reactive, and really that there's this not just a responsibility on road users, but a shared responsibility, one that may even go beyond shared to one that's the ultimate responsibility of system designers. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things based on our experience. One, it's easy to, when we talk about safe system or Vision Zero, it's hard sometimes to identify that responsibility lies with the system designers, because to sort of normal practitioners or others, when you say system designers, that sounds kind of strange. What we're talking about are policymakers, engineers, transport planners, urban planners. Those are the system designers, and those are the people who have this responsibility. And I think drawing on what we have experienced, and I want to reclassify the title a little bit of cases of WRI success. These are successes that are going on in Colombia, India, and Brazil, are places where we're supporting those, along with partners like Bloomberg Philanthropies, FIA Foundation. We're helping to influence those cities, but those cities are the ones that are coming up with these successes. And we heard from Juan Pablo Bocarejo today about Bogota Vision Zero, the city advancing, especially the speed limits along, changes along these main corridors. You know, I think one of the key challenges we've had is really convincing the people within the city that it is your responsibility to make roads safe. And that, it's an easy thing to say, but it's not necessarily, ownership of that is not taken immediately. It takes time for that to happen. We have a saying that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and we need to be that squeaky wheel saying, hey, this is about the system designers, the policymakers, and others, the engineers taking responsibility rather than leaning back again and again on road users. So that's one lesson. Another one from Addis Ababa was we had this same idea that, well, there are so many people dying on the roads, if they would just learn to cross the street better and use footbridges, especially. That's a thing that we commonly see is people saying, if the pedestrians will just use the footbridge, or if we just construct more footbridges, then the problem will be solved. Well, the system's design is not making it so that the footbridge will be used even if you put it in place. And in a place like Addis Ababa, where some 86% of the road fatalities are pedestrians, you need to have a different conversation. So the city there put together a road safety strategy in which they didn't say call it Vision Zero, but they made a statement in that strategy that said we do not want any more road trauma, and is essentially equal to having a zero vision or Vision Zero. But part of that was reframing the way they think about the city and looking at, 86% of these deaths are pedestrians. If we follow 1, 2, and 3 measures that maybe deal with drink driving or seatbelts, those are important things, but are those things going to impact this huge number of pedestrians? So when you look at the Addis Ababa Road Safety Strategy, you actually see this reflected, that one of the directions of that saying is that the pedestrian is the first, second, and third priority of our strategy. And then other directions of the strategy even go further to improving the pedestrian conditions. So that's one point. I think there's a constant conversation that needs to be happening about the context of each place and how Vision Zero or a safe system applies in that case. The second point I want to make is just on this, is that we do need to look at the context of each and every location that is pursuing a Vision Zero approach. I mentioned Addis, 86% of the fatalities, pedestrians. You have others where it might be, like in Vietnam, upwards of 80% of the fatalities are two-wheeler motorcycles. In the US, we have a lot of vulnerable users killed, but there's also a lot of road crashes caused by the high vehicle kilometers or vehicle miles traveled in the country. So looking at each place and the individual characteristics and what is going on, I think that analysis is indeed required to move things forward. And even with reflecting on IRAP's work here, that we've seen some of the great work that's going on. When you look at the different star ratings, Rob was showing, hey, let's get 5-star for pedestrian ratings across DC. That's more appropriate for DC, right? Because we have a lot of pedestrians. We need to look at those different factors that are within the star ratings, within the different context of the roads. So the last 3 minutes left, I want to make 2 more points. One is on the issue of speed. One thing that we've walked away with from a lot of these cities is there is one common thing, and a lot of that is that the cars are going too fast on many of the roads. And we have 2 things that are going on. One are people are just driving fast because the roads are designed for them to move fast, so that the target speed of the road, the design speed of the road is quite high. And that's a design issue that we need to look at. The second thing is that oftentimes the posted speed or the regulated speed are out of line with what they should be for that urban environment. In the Netherlands, where they had the genesis of sustainable safety, in Sweden with Vision Zero, I know Matsaka can speak more to Sweden and the speed limit changes that have happened there according to the different roads, particularly on rural roads, where you can even increase speeds if you're changing the design for certain safety elements. But in the Netherlands, there was really this concerted effort to reclassify all of the roads according to a road function that fits its use. And when we see in cities like Accra in Ghana or Addis Ababa, where they had 60, 70, 80 kilometer per hour speed limits on regular urban roads, on main roads that have mixed land uses, high numbers of pedestrians. Those roads are not appropriate for 70, 80 kilometer hour speeds. Sometimes those are allowed under the law where the law needs to be changed. In other cases, they may not even be allowed, but they're still being put at 70, 80 kilometers per hour. So I think one thing that we can do is really take a hard look at what are the rules and how are roads classified and what are the design specifications for these various roads. If we're going to have an effect, I think we really need to do that. And I think you see the early successes from Bogota and Mexico City. Another example, in Rio, we often mention, people know Ipanema Beach, they know Copacabana. The speed limit on the road next to those two beaches where you have hundreds of people every day is 70 kilometers per hour. That's simply unacceptable. That's actually, if you look at the Brazilian code, it's kind of debatable whether it's actually allowed. Is it, maybe it's 60 kilometers per hour under the rules. So both the rules and the practices probably need to change. Lastly, I'm just going to end on a call for people to think in cities, particularly about the idea of complete streets, or in the Dutch maybe call them living streets, or where these are streets where people live, work, and play. That's what cities are. And what we have is a growing movement to have this idea of complete streets, policies and practices that basically regulate and require streets to provide design for all road users, prioritizing the movement of pedestrians, bicyclists, and public transit. I don't have a lot of time, and I'm out here now, but I do want to encourage people more to visit some of WRI's work in Brazil on complete streets, or Ruas Completas, for our Brazilian colleagues here, and for our work on Streets for All in India. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Just want to reiterate a point that you made about getting locals involved. What we find in our projects at IRAP is that the projects we can get the most buy-in from the locals are the ones that are most likely to succeed. We can't go in there and say, okay, this is what you need to do, this, and this. We need to get them to buy the idea and be involved and really take it forward, because we can't save lives until the locals, the road designers, the engineers in the country are out there. They've changed their mind and they've changed the way of thinking, essentially. And it's a really good point you make there. And also about the speeds. Obviously, speeds are critical, and we can't avoid talking about speeds, even though in certain cities it's a difficult and politically difficult discussion to have. Up next, we've got Julio Urzua, who is the Regional Director of the Americas for IRAP, and he's also the head of Star Rating for Schools. So he's going to be talking about success stories that we've had within IRAP, from Bogota in Brazil to BHP in Chile, and also in some other areas of Latin America.
As Morgan said, I am going to be talking now in these 10 minutes about some stories that I could share about examples that we have of projects in different countries in Latin America. But I wanted to show different type of projects. So the first one, I'm going to be talking about a concessionaire, which is a private company. Then I'm going to talk about a national project of a country. Then one example of the Star Rating for Schools, which is a very specific program focused on school areas. And finally, I am going to talk about one example of our Bloomberg Initiative projects. So the Autopista Central in Chile, it's a road that is concessions. It's run by a big concessionaire company, one of the largest in the world, that is called Abertis. It's more than 100 kilometers road. And they called us to do this assessment using our methodology. So we divided the road into these 4 sections, and under each section we subdivided the road. And finally, we got the star ratings. And the first conclusion that we got from the star rating is that there was a little stretch for vehicle occupants that was 2-star. So the first decision that the private company made, they said, okay, we are going to eliminate this 2-star, and then we are going to create a plan for the future to continue improving the standard of this road. So as you see there in the star rating map, if we zoom, you see this little stretch that is with red color, this one. So they immediately made the decision of eliminating this red color. So this is the information of this little stretch, and there you have what we call the risk worm, and you see that there is an area that is in the 2-star with a red color. So there you can see exactly which is the area of the 2-star from this stretch. So this is the junction that we are talking about. And in the implementation plan, we proposed to them several countermeasures. There you can see 4 of them. The first countermeasure was to implementing shoulder rumble strips on this area to improve the conditions. So there is where we are proposing the shoulder rumble strips in this little stretch that, as I said before, was 2-star red color. And this is how it looked after the implementation. So they implemented this specific countermeasure, and the new risk worm went from the red color that you see, it went down to the next to 3-star. So there you see the differences. So this is the new star rating map that you see now. But in addition to this implementation plan for this particular point, that was in 2015, they said, okay, we are going to continue implementing new countermeasures for 2016. So there you can see where it says Ruta 5 is one of the stretches that we are talking about. 52% was 2-star, but then they continued implementing, and in 2017, it was not 52, it was 42 2-star. So they continued advancing. And then in the year 2018, they continued working on other areas of the other stretches of the road, like Eje General Velázquez and Autopista Central. And then they continued with the, not only on the road, but also with the side of the road, eliminating those points that are more dangerous. And you can see that in 2019, next year, this is how the star ratings are going to look like. So no more 60% of 2-star in the stretches. And in 2020, this is how it's going to look like. So this is an example of one private company that assessed the infrastructure, and they created a plan. This little assessment of only one road of Abertis led us to assess the whole network of Abertis in the world. So we are finishing a project in more than 6 or 7 countries, 10,000 kilometers. So from this particular project of 118 kilometers, now we are assessing 10,000 kilometers with Abertis. Rob was mentioning before the example of Belize. Belize is a small country near to Mexico and Guatemala. They called us to assess a demonstration corridor. As you see in the graph there, the pie chart, it says that in the demonstration corridor, the fatalities were 34%, only in this demonstration corridor between 2001 and 2012. So, again, we did the process, and we came out with this implementation plan. They implemented, there you can see some pictures of the implementation, and look at what happened. In 2009, the 70 people died on the whole network of Belize. And only in the demonstration corridor, they were 33. In other words, 47% of deaths were occurring only in one demonstration corridor, in this demonstration corridor. And after the implementation, that was figures from 2009. So 4 years later, in 2013, the 47% dropped to 11. And then in 2014 to 11 again, 2015 to 7, 2016 to 8. While, as you can see, if you can see the column of countrywide, the number of deaths in the rest of the country continued increasing. So this is a good example of, again, a public policy of a country that is using the tools for implementing countermeasures and reducing the number of deaths. The star rating for schools is something that we are starting with. This year, we have been piloting the tool. In April next year, we are going to launch this project widely in the world. But this is how the application looks like when I download it into a tablet or in a smartphone. So you can go into the application, and this year we have been showing and explaining and training people around the world to different partners. And this is just one example of the 500 schools that we have, in which we have tested the application around the world, more than 500 schools. This is in a school in La Candelaria in Bogota, Colombia. This is how the school looked like before the implementation. And this is after the piloting, the testing that was carried out in this school. And this is finally how it looked like. So it was improved, the conditions of 3 points of the school. And let's see the star ratings. As you see there in that table, it says antes for before and después for after. 5 data points were collected. The first 2 data points were 5 stars, so nothing was done. But in the other data points, the data point number 3, 4, and 5, they were 2, 3, and 3 star. But after the implementation, they became 4, 4, and 5. Therefore, it's a demonstration of that the improvement of the star ratings of these particular points created a much safer environment for kids that are pedestrians. As I said, this is only one example of the 500 that we have tested in different countries around the world. Finally, I wanted to show this slide of BRS Fortaleza, the Bloomberg initiative. So 150 kilometers of roads and 9 corridors have been assessed in Fortaleza since 2016 using IRAP tools. 2 corridors, this is the Avenida Osorio de Paiva and Avenida Leste Oeste, assessed in 2016. They were reassessed after implementation 2 years later in 2018. And there you can see again the two graphs. WRI, our partners, they provided the technical support for the road safety interventions, and also the speed limits were reduced. And look at this, across the city, there were more than 12,000 injury crashes and 251 fatality crashes. And in 2017, compared to the 2017, more than 14,274 deaths. So once again, it's a good example of a public policy, in this case, applied to only a city, that it had a big impact in the reduction of crashes and deaths. Thank you.
Leave that. Thanks a lot, Julio. Your work on the star rating for schools is really interesting. So if anyone doesn't know about the program, take a look online or have a chat to Julio or Rafaela, who's upstairs in the break. Up next, we have Blair Turner, who's the Principal Technology Leader at the Australian Road Research Board. And he's going to talk about measuring success through star ratings, global, national, and local level examples.
Excellent. Thanks, Morgan, and good afternoon, everybody. So I work for the National Research Institute in Australia for roads, and my area of interest is around how to construct roads and maintain roads more safely, so that safe road infrastructure perspective. And that's the perspective I'll take to this presentation today, but it can equally apply to all elements of managing roads, including the behavioural, vehicle, post-crash care sides as well. In terms of ways to improve road safety immediately, one of the highest priorities for me would be to better manage our information and performance manage our knowledge around the performance of safety on our roads. And that's really the focus for this presentation today. So you've probably been made aware already of some of the goals in terms of road safety performance targets at international level. Two of those relate directly to safe road infrastructure. So action number 3 relates to the construction of new roads. And the wording there is that by 2030, all new roads will achieve the technical standards, and it actually refers to a 3-star rating or better. So Rob showed us that earlier today. The other one relates to the existing road network, and again, some metrics around making sure that we upgrade our roads to meet technical standards. And it's a little bit vaguer. There's no firm definitions around that. And that's really what this presentation today is about, that it's vitally important that we put in place our performance targets around where we want to be around safety performance of our roads, and then we actually track our progress and measure our progression towards those targets over time. So it's been recognised at global level. We have now global information about where we need to go. That's the 3-star or better rating. And there's certainly a lot of countries who have embraced that, and I'll show some examples in a moment. We're actually involved in a current study, and this is a very early preview of some of the results from that through the World Road Association. And we did a review of 31 countries from low, medium, and high incomes to really ask them about what are you doing in the space around measuring your progress around the infrastructure you're providing. What are the key performance indicators that you're actually using to measure that progress? We found across that range of countries that around half had some form of measurement around their progression and safety, so only half. And I guess it's no surprise that most of those were actually in the high income category. And breaking that down into further detail, we actually looked more closely at what sort of targets are currently being used, how are we setting targets, and how are we measuring our progress towards those targets. And some are very loose and weak, so there's a category there around what percentage of the roads are being assessed, or how many road safety audits are you undertaking? And that's a step in the right direction, but there's certainly room for improvement there. Others are around the extent of the road network that will be improved over the short-term duration. So how many kilometres of extra provision of safe roads, or how many more intersections will be upgraded? And again, that's positive and moves us in the right direction. But I think most powerful of all are the ones around the percent of travel on safe roads, and that's really where the IRAP star ratings come into play. And there's certainly some countries have actually got us a target now, the percentage of travel that will occur on roads. And another category, which is perhaps a subset of that, and that is what percentage of travel will be undertaken on roads that have got certain types of road infrastructure provision. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. So in terms of countries that have targets, there's been a brief mention of this earlier today. I won't go through all of these. Several countries and several global institutions actually have targets now around where they want to be around their infrastructure provision. So star ratings in terms of the amount of travel undertaken. So that's a great step forward. We know where we want to be, and we can put timeframes around that. In Australia, we've actually also embraced this approach. Our most recent National Action Plan includes provision for safe travel on 3-star roads or better, so 80% on our state road network. So that's at our national level. We've set this target now for where we want to be. And in terms of individual states in Australia, similarly, we've got states also having this target, and they've been in place in some cases for quite a bit of time. Probably the most progressive is Queensland, and I'll show you an example at the end about how they're using that metric. So that's your overall overarching infrastructure safety measure, the IRAP star rating. But one thing I think we just need to recognise is that when we collect information for IRAP, we collect a lot of detail. There's a lot of attributes we have information on, and so we can put that to good use around some of the sub-targets we might want to use when we measure our safety performance. So we're seeing, and I borrow heavily here from the fantastic work from Sweden in terms of their target setting and key performance indicators around safety. In Australia right now, we're working towards our next road safety strategies, which will be from 2021 onwards. And it's pretty important that within that strategy, we embed some key performance indicators that mark exactly where we want to be by a certain date. And that will include star ratings, but it also will include some more detailed markers which will lead us towards those better star ratings for our roads. And so it's things like what percentage of travel on roads that have got a speed limit of 80 kilometres per hour have got side road barrier protection. And that will help us eliminate the death and serious injury from run-off road crashes. Similarly, what percentage of travel on roads will have a median barrier or median separation? And that will help us eliminate the deaths and serious injuries around head-on crashes. And similarly for our intersection crash types, for our residential areas, for our cyclists and our pedestrians. And that's really where the work is being conducted now to try and identify what are those subcategories and those performance indicator targets we should be putting in place to actually manage our safety and track our performance. So the idea is we set our objectives into a future time frame. It might be 2040, and it might be by 2040 we want to eliminate all roads where there are no median barriers where the speed limit's above 80 km per hour, and then we can back project from that and say, well, by 2030 we need to have X amount of network covered. So this gives us a really good pathway towards implementation of safe road infrastructure. It allows us to track our progress towards those targets on an evidence-based approach. We know that these treatments are highly effective. So we can use these both in this infrastructure space, but also for the other pillars within the system. So we need the data to do this, and this is one of the major, I think, benefits that IRAP brings to us. We can actually break down our targets into to more achievable goals and more visible goals. When we do that, we start to also introduce the element of accountability. A lot of our old targets were around percent reductions in fatal and serious injuries, so perhaps a 30% reduction by 2020. And the reality there is that when those targets aren't met, no one is responsible. But when we start to break these targets down into these smaller chunks, these targets here are actually targets which are accountable in terms of those who need to deliver the outcomes. So road agencies have these targets and these responsibilities. So if they don't meet these targets, they are accountable. Similarly, our behavioural measures or our post-crash care measures, again, there's increased accountability once we set these basic targets into the future. So that means we need to collect this data, and we can do this already through the data we use through our IRAP data collection processes. We can set our end goals. We want 100% coverage by X date, and we can set our interim goals to actually get there. And then we can track our performance towards those goals. And all of those steps are really important and will form parts of a lot of our future strategies. Just lastly, I just want to talk about this issue about celebrating success and how we've used this in Australia in terms of the IRAP star ratings. This is one example. This is the Bruce Highway in Queensland. And this is actually an award-winning project from the Queensland government for one section of one of the worst bits of road in the whole country, and was actually recognised within the media and at public level that this was one of the deadliest highway stretches in the country. So it attracted massive media attention, massive political attention, and interestingly at a time around elections in the state, and it almost became a bidding war in terms of the two major parties all competing to see who could actually invest the most to upgrade this bit of network. And that was really achieved through the advocacy from the local motoring club, the RACQ in Queensland, who did a rating, an AusRAP rating for this bit of network, and it came out at 2 stars. It was a high level of trauma, of injury, and that was 19 casualties in a 5-year period, and I believe 5 of those were actually fatal injuries or fatal outcomes. So the motoring club RACQ did the star rating, 2 stars, and that was used within advocacy, within the media, high exposure in terms of the public and at political level. And so they're able to raise the agenda, raise the interest in the agenda around this location. And that led to a major investment in this bit of network. And you can see from the results there that The 2-star sections of road were replaced by this bypass section, which is now mostly 4, and in some cases 5-star. And the reason that it was so important to apply OSRAP in this instance was that even before this road was built, we could tell it was going to be 4-star or 5-star. We didn't have to wait 3 years or 5 years for that crash data to roll in. We could actually celebrate the success immediately, that this was going to have a major benefit. And we could predict in advance the number of crashes that would be saving, the number of fatal and serious injuries that would be saved. So in the before versus after period, the actual analysis showed that we had about an 80% reduction in the casualty crashes, fatal and serious injuries on this bit of network. And as I mentioned, it's a 4 or 5-star bit of network now. And that was achieved through moving from the bottom left image there, which was poor roadside protection, poor intersection design, through to having separation, grade separated intersections, roadside protection, and all the known solutions that can make a difference. The other byproduct of this project was the safer design meant that we could actually safely increase the speed limit at this location, which has got a benefit, in this case, to the economy as well. So it was able to increase the speed limit because the design was so much better. So just quickly, in summary, we need, I believe, one of the major things we can do to improve safety is to provide robust outcome and intermediate measures for us to set our targets properly and to track our performance for those targets. IRAP's been used at global level, national level, local level to help us to set targets and track our performance. Just don't forget, though, when you collect this data, there's a lot of detail underlying that, and it can be used to set these sub-targets as well. So I'd highly recommend you think about this for your next strategies. That helps us track our performance towards those objectives. And it also helps us celebrate our success, not downstream, but immediately at opening time for these sorts of projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Blair. It's just so fantastic to see how institutionalized the IRAP methodology is in Australia and just how well it's working. It's really positive. Up next, we've got Nader Asma, who's going to be talking about Vision Zero and the Los Angeles experience. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Nader Asmar. I'm a principal engineer with the Department of Transportation in Los Angeles. It's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon to talk to you about our experience. I wouldn't say it's a complete success story, but we've just started out and we're starting to see some results, but we have a long way to go, as you'll see. First, I just wanted to show you how big Los Angeles is, just so you get a sense for the reach that we have. It seems to go on, forever. It's like endless sprawl. Geographically, if you look at it, you can fit all these major American cities within the city of Los Angeles boundaries. So we have a lot of different neighborhoods in the city, a lot of different city centers. Seems like we have multiple downtown areas, and they each have their own unique flavor that we have to address. Here's some key statistics for Los Angeles, but the one that is really key is that half of our city is really in the valley, and that area was implemented and designed sort of after World War II, was designed for the vehicle. It's very long stretches of street that are very wide, and they encourage people to drive about 40 to 45 miles an hour, hitting all the green lights without a lot of places for people to cross. So that's part of our challenge in the city of Los Angeles, is how do we change that to a city that's more pedestrian friendly. We also manage over 4,500 signalized intersections in the city. I think that's second to New York City. So there's a lot of work that we need to do there. Also, LA is known for its traffic congestion. Last year, LA was ranked #1 in terms of the number of hours spent in congestion in the world, really. 102 hours. So there's different movements in Los Angeles, as I'll talk about. One of them is there's this whole movement against anything that slows down traffic, right? So if we want to do a road diet, there's people who are going to protest it immediately, and they're all ready to go with their lawyers. a lot of this mirrors what we talked about earlier, but it's just a graphic that we use a lot in LA showing, and this is in imperial units, not metric units, but at 20 miles an hour, if you're hit by a vehicle, you have an 80% chance of survival, but at 40 miles an hour, that decreases all the way down to just 10%. And so part of the goal is to slow down traffic as much as possible. That's a bit of a challenge in LA because actually the state of California has very strict rules on speed limits and how you set speed limits. You have to base it on what cars are driving. You can't just say, I want to make this road 25 miles an hour. And there's no such thing as having like a citywide speed limit like they have in some other cities. In the state of California, you have to follow a certain methodology. This graph shows the history of the number of fatalities that we've had in LA since 2007. Vision Zero, as I'll show you, started in 2015 in LA, but we didn't really start doing implementing measures until about 2017. But for some reason in 2016, the whole country, United States, saw a huge increase in the number of pedestrian fatalities. And that was a countrywide trend that also affected the city of Los Angeles. It could be due to a number of factors. People speculate it could be the economy getting better, more people driving, cell phone use. There's even speculation about marijuana use, but I'm not sure. Also, if you look at the chart on the right, Los Angeles ranks #1 as far as the number of people killed per 100,000 population in the country at 6.27, higher than all those other cities. There's some other statistics there, but the key number for me is that traffic collisions are the leading cause of death for those between ages of 2 and 14 in Los Angeles. And that's really sobering for me personally because I just think of those people and how young they are. LA has done a good job recently of reducing its violent crime, so the traffic fatalities have risen to the top. So because of these things, in 2015, the mayor, Eric Garcetti, literally set up a podium in the street and signed executive directive number 10 with all the city leaders, including Salida Reynolds, who's the general manager of the Department of Transportation, implementing Vision Zero in the city of Los Angeles. So in 2016, we spent about a full year digging into the data very heavily and developing a safety study that looked at where everything was happening and an action plan. Both were released in early 2017. The safety plan, the safety study looked at who was being killed, when and where they were being killed, and why. And it looked at 5 years of collision data between 2009 and 2013. Also, it looked at, it determined that unsafe speed is the top contributing collision factor to collisions resulting in death, which is no surprise. Of course, older adults are 11% of LA's population, but 26% of the fatalities. And again, this was something that was highlighted earlier. 70% of death or serious injury collisions of people walking or biking involved a male driver. So we had to start somewhere, so developed a high injury network in the city of LA. It's only 6% of our streets, but it's still over 450 miles of streets that we had to look at. And with a city so large, we had to start somewhere, so we started with the high injury network. And we also developed what we call priority corridors. We did surveys, we used the Vision Zero Alliance feedback, and we did in-person surveys and looked at the top 3 factors that people wanted to use as far as giving priority to the streets that we were going to do in our action plan for 2017. Became severity, vulnerability, and social equity. And so we used a rating system where we rated intersections by giving them each a score. So every intersection that has severe injury got a point, and if there was a fatality, it got another 1.5 points. And if the fatality or a severe injury involved a child or senior, it got another point. And if it was in a community, a target community where it was underserved, we get another additional point. And by mapping these points, we were able to get our priority corridors for 2017. So we developed an action plan for 2017. We also are developing, we also developed an action plan for 2018. But the first action plan showed a commitment to the 3 E's of engineering, education, and enforcement. Also looked at additional E's like equity, engagement, and evaluation of our projects, and it set goals and benchmarks up to the year 2025. We were supposed to achieve a 20% reduction in fatalities by the year 2017. So we're a little bit behind, but it's still our goal to reach zero by 2025. So we immediately began to analyze the priority corridors. We developed analyses for each corridor of the priority corridors. There was 40 of them. We looked at where vehicle collisions were, where bicycle collisions were, where vehicle-to-vehicle collisions were, and we mapped everything, and we looked at things we can do to improve them. And so we came up with this just basic chart that shows countermeasures that we can implement in the city of Los Angeles, and whether we needed, to change policies that we have internally or not, whether we needed to work with other departments, and we strategized how we would apply these measures to all these 40 priority corridors in a sequential order. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the measures that we're looking at. And in each one, we indicated if it was a low, medium, or high cost, the time frame it would take, and the effectiveness of that measure. This one is just basically narrowing intersections with paint to slow people down. The curb extension, which is a concrete measure that narrows the street at an intersection and reduces the crossing distance. Speed feedback signs, which coupled with a speed limit sign, give you the speed at which you're driving. This is something we implemented programmatically over all of our priority corridors in order to make people aware of how fast they're driving. Leading pedestrian intervals, which Chicago also talked about. Washington, D.C. also talked about, where you give the pedestrians a head start by 3 to 7 seconds before the vehicles get a green. And it basically gives a head start to pedestrians. Pedestrian activated beacons. We have rectangular flashing beacons, yellow beacons. We're also looking at installing our first Hawk in the city of Los Angeles coming up. Of course, new traffic signals, which improve safety. And then another thing we have in the city of LA, we don't have a whole lot of left turn phases, but we're implementing a lot of them right now. Many vehicles typically have to yield to the oncoming traffic, and when there's a gap, they turn. But we're implementing these at a lot of intersections now. The road diet, which has been difficult to implement in LA, which I can talk about a little bit later if we have time. And pedestrian refuge islands, which are concrete elements we can put in the street to help people cross, give them safe haven until they get to the other side. And scramble crosswalks, which we've implemented about 5 of those in the last year or 2, and they've been very successful. One last thing is we have a phased approach to implementation where we take the easy stuff we do right away. Phase 1 is mostly paint and signs. Phase 2 we call our signal upgrades, which take a year or 2 to get in the ground. And then our phase 3 improvements typically are concrete improvements that take other departments in the city to design and take 2 to 3 years to implement. We also have a very robust education and outreach campaign. And there's videos we prepared, and we targeted things to particular communities. We put things on Pandora, Spotify, YouTube. And I don't know if there's a video that we can run right now. Just real quick, it's 30 seconds long.
911, what's your emergency?
I need an ambulance. I hit a little girl on a bike. I'm at Central and Vernon.
Okay, sir, paramedics are on the way.
I was only going 40.
Possible fatality, Central and Vernon.
Please hurry. She's hurt bad.
And we also had the Los Angeles Rams do an ad for us, which was very successful. We've done community-based outreach in different communities. At every place we had a priority corridor. And we did project-based outreach where we looked at countermeasures on the streets and met with the communities multiple times to get their buy-in on the measures. This is my last slide where we receive this from LAPD every week, which basically tells us how we're doing. And the line in red is what we pay attention to, which tells us how many people were killed up to this year. As you can see, we peaked in 2016 where we had year-to-date 220 people died. This year to date we're at 195, which is too high, but it's down about 11% since 2016. So we still have a lot of work to do to get to zero, but it's a good start, I believe. And with that, that's my presentation.
Thanks a lot, Neda. Very interesting that in Los Angeles, there's no real enforcement of the speed. It's more about making, well, in your presentation at least, it's more about making it feel safer at a lower speed, making the driver feel like they need to go slower rather than forcing them to through traffic, through radars and things like that. Maybe I'll ask you a question about it later. Just on that one, if there are any questions coming in from online, if you can send them through and we'll ask those in the panel discussion afterwards. Up next, there's a slight change to the program. Nestor Roa wasn't able to make it, so in his place, we're going to have Ana Maria Pinto, who is the transport lead specialist at the IDB. Welcome.
Thank you, and apologies on Nestor's behalf, but he had a last-minute urgent matter to attend. So instead you have me, but I hope I can live up to your expectations with this presentation, which I wanted to first apologize in a way for the title, because what I'm going to talk is not really a success story, because the success will be that we really help to lower the rates or the deaths, and we haven't done that, but I'm going to anyway talk to you about what we've been doing specifically in the region, at least to help, at least, as I said, don't want to be negative, but as well, I don't want as well to congratulate us on everything that we still have to do. So, as many as you know, but I just want to tell you that we have transport specialists in every country in the region, almost. In some, we have more than one. And so we have specialized transport specialists helping the governments implementing this agenda. And as I said this morning, that's why we do these events and we train and we study these issues so we can take the best, the latest at least, best practices that we have on road safety across the region. And in doing this, we have our main, one of my main lines of work, of course, is lending money and financing projects in the region. We have, at the moment, an active portfolio of 12 billion projects that we're financing. And we have estimated that in the last 10 years, we have managed to invest specifically on road safety actions around 300 million. And we can analyze that data because as well, sometimes you cannot isolate what is road safety or what is actually building. And that's something that I wanted to reflect or talk to you today as well, that I think we will be successful when we actually don't isolate the road safety investments and it's like kind of part of the whole infrastructure project without saying this is for road safety, but the whole investment is a safe on its own, you know, it's a good, it's a road, how can I say, safe proof, or it's safe, basically. So in doing this, we have a strategy. The bank has a road safety strategy that is based on the 5 pillars, but that we're working as well on how to do a more comprehensive and not working on these isolate issues. But we're having actions in safe infrastructure, in post-crash response, of course, working with the victims associations, and as well with the system. And I will tell you specifically what we're doing. We're doing institutional work, we're doing vulnerable users, and as well we're working on safer vehicles. And but as well, we're very aware that the whole picture is changing. We have lots of new things are happening. As I said before, our urbanization rates growing, motorization is still growing, which is I think something that we have still to debate here. We have new technologies, mobile phone use while we're driving. I mean, I think although some things keep the same, we still have to update the strategy because lots of things are changing in the region and in the world, and that's why we have to keep improving and changing the paradigm. And as well, we have an opportunity in Latin America that I think is unique and is happening, and we have to act now, and is that we are undertaking at the moment very important urban projects as metro projects or train projects or urban transport projects that are being constructed or bidding, or I mean, they're under implementation. And we are part, or we finance or advising the government in these projects, and I'm referring to Lima Metro, Quito Metro, Bogota Metro, Sao Paulo, Panama, that are really changing the urban structure of our cities, and that are a unique opportunity to make them safe or produce a safe system or be part of the safe system. And we're working with the government and advising in these projects to have this effect. But I mean, that's as well something that I would like to discuss or talk to you about, how we kind of really focus on our work in these cities. I mean, as I say, this opportunity, and every city now is looking, I mean, San Jose as well, Costa Rica is looking for a light train system. I mean, every city is doing this because, of course, congestion is not getting any better. So I think as road safety practitioners or believers, we have an opportunity to work directly with this government, these cities, and in all the cities to actually tackle interventions specifically to these projects. That's why the bank keeps working with the governments in the institutional capacity. We have seen some examples of great transport authorities that are working on these projects, and that if you don't have that, you cannot make these interventions effective. We keep working with governments in data, big thing in our region. Eugenia is going to talk to us about the coming report on road safety indicators, world indicators, and that we're all looking forward to see how the numbers are coming out. But as well, we rely on the data of the governments. We still have lots to do and improve. And we're working on specific plans, helping the governments to develop these road safety plans, and now are moving towards zero or vision zero road safety plans. We keep working as well with Latin NCAP. We have this, I mean, we're supporting and we strongly believe on what Latin NCAP is doing. As I said before, we had a meeting with all the governments, the representatives from the governments 2 weeks ago here in DC, where we look at some studies, data, and strategies to try to improve the situation in Latin America with the standards of vehicles, which is very low, and we have a big challenge because we still don't have the regulations, and as well the consumers, of course, and the auto makers still selling no safe cars, and not talking about the existing and used cars as well that are in not very good conditions in the region. And talking about the safe system, we're working, and someone mentioned, I think you, Julio, about the Safe Route to School program. We as well working with United Nations and WRI in implementing this project in our region, capacity building with local authorities, with schools, because we believe that this has to be like an online platform, educational program that really help local governments to implement this on every level. I'm not going to repeat, but of course, this should be one of our main focus, given the numbers and the statistics that our kids are very vulnerable and one of the main victims in this situation. We're working as well with PAHO, on the study reducing risk factors, alcohol, drugs abuse, all the factors that are helping us, that can help us to reduce the risk factors for drivers. And we're working as well, and Mikel is here with FIA for FIA, in a project that is really taking us quite a lot of this year, but that we believe this can be really a game changer, working with the insurance sector in helping them or bringing them into the table to be more active, have an active role in helping us to prevent road crashes. And how? With better data, helping them to, or asking them to give us more strategies to prevention and to change the attitude of drivers. And of course, in being a better mechanism to compensate and attend to the victims. So we've been having some seminars, some meetings this year, and we believe in that we're having some pilot projects in Dominican Republic, Paraguay, I don't remember the other one, Dominican Republic, Paraguay, and Bolivia, helping to change the regulation, but as well to make, help work with insurance companies to have more active role in the prevention of road crashes. Last but not least, we really believe as well in training actions, and I take this opportunity to talk about our online course that lots of you have helped us to record videos, and it's online, it's accessible to online through our edX platform, and that helps to deliver the message about road safety in a very effective manner, I believe. We keep working with journalists in seminars of helping them to spread the message in a more proactive way and not just once the crashes happen. So we have a very good response from the media. And as well, we are doing something that is as well part of the core of the bank, which is knowledge and dissemination of technical papers to help governments as well on the delivery of better policies. This is what we do, but now we deliver on Vision Zero, and what we want to incorporate is more, as I say, evidence and targeted actions in specific projects to help the governments to get better results. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Ana Maria. It's really good to see the IDB focus on all the different aspects of the safe system approach. One thing, coming from Australia and now living in Latin America, I find outrageous is that vehicles, as you mentioned, are sold without the same safety, the same airbags, the same safety features in Latin America as they are in the US and Australia and Europe. And if you do want them, it's a luxury. If you want to buy a car with airbags, it's a luxury. So it's something that's outrageous, and I think it really needs to change. Up next, we've got a panel discussion. Before we get into that, I'd just like to introduce the two other people here on stage. We've got Veronica Vanterpool, Deputy Director of Vision Zero Network, and Mats Arkibellen, who's a Senior Advisor at Trafikverket, joining us here. The session panel is on, the question that we're going to tackle here is an interesting one. It's from countries to cities to corporates. Where will Vision Zero start, and how can it be expanded? So first up, I'd like to ask Mats, being one of the architects of the Vision Zero strategy, I'd like you to tackle this question first, and then we'll move along to other members here.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to say that it's fantastic to be here today and listen to all the speaker and the discussion about Vision Zero. I still feel young, but I was involved when everything started in Sweden in 1995. And as you say, the Vision Zero was adopted by the Swedish government, the Swedish Parliament in 1997. So I was quite young at that time, and I remember the whole discussion in our society about this Vision Zero and to be honest, people thought that we were a little bit crazy, I think, you know. And then after that, when we adopted and we start to do things based on this Vision Zero, for me, is definitely, and I think that some of the speakers today have been into it today, that it's a paradigm shift. It's a policy innovation. It's a different way to think about safety, and it's different from what we think traditionally. And of course, now we see that one aspect I can see that really is start to diffuse around the world is the kind of ethical imperative that says that we can't accept that people get killed and serious injuries. And that's very different from especially the transport sector's mindset, where they say, well, of course we don't want people get killed and serious injuries, but it's a kind of price that we have to pay for our mobility. And Vision Zero is really challenged that kind of idea. And now this is spreading around the world, but it's not only spreading to transport, in transport, it's also spreading to other sectors. We did a paper that we look into some Vision Zero kind of policy when it comes to suicide, occupational health, and other sectors in our society. So it seems to be an interesting kind of phenomena, this Vision Zero, and it's broader than the transport community. I would like to say that. But then, for us who's been involved in it, Vision Zero differs from the traditional way to work with safety in several dimensions. And that is, I think, the big challenge now, that what will be diffused? Will we put this Vision Zero now as a kind of, someone had it on their slide, a slogan? Then we will keep going with the similar things that we have done before, a little bit more of the same we have done before. And I think it's good to see when it's spreading now, because then we can start to compare different countries with different cities and everything, and we can do more research about the implementation of this Vision Zero, because I think that even if we're talking about the same thing, Vision Zero, the content might be very different. So that's why sometimes I say that the Swedish Vision Zero, because make sure that while we think in a certain way, and maybe that's a bit different from other contexts. So that will be interesting to see, and I like these kind of events now when we start to talking together about it. But for me to be involved in this, it's amazing. You know, I'm stunning about the whole idea that I hear some people now talking about things that I have talked about for 20 years, and in English. I used to listen to it in the Swedish, so yeah.
In English, Portuguese, Spanish, etc. Veronica, can you share your experience from, it'll be a US experience, I guess, so can you share how your experience differs from the Swedish experience?
Yes. So as they think about countries to cities to corporates, in the United States, really Vision Zero started in the civic sector. It started in the advocacy sector. It started in New York City with one of our, a well-known advocacy organization that had a lot of communication with Mats and others in Sweden, and decided to bring this concept into New York City. And from there, it took hold. But unlike what I've heard during today's conference, where Vision Zero is starting from the federal government, or maybe starting in the corporate sector, in the United States, again, it started in the advocacy community. And what the Vision Zero Network is doing is actually harnessing that energy, that activism, and making sure that we're connecting that with cities as well. So I mentioned earlier in my presentation, there's about 34 cities in the United States that are known as Vision Zero cities. And it's not enough to say, we support Vision Zero, or we like Vision Zero. Being a Vision Zero city means a commitment to Vision Zero. And what's different in the United States, I think, is we are putting the pressure on the decision makers. So those commissioners, those mayors, that is where we want to see the commitment for Vision Zero in the United States, at that level. And again, that works hand in hand with the advocacy community. Advocacy and advocates hold these decision makers accountable for the decisions they make or the decisions they do not make. And that is how we've seen this movement toward Vision Zero spread throughout the United States. In this instance, it's good that there's contagion, right? We don't like to think that contagion is a good thing. But when it comes to Vision Zero, or it comes to efforts, quite frankly, across any sector to save lives, we do want to see that contagion. So we're seeing it in some smaller cities, and we're seeing it in our larger cities. So I think to tackle the second part of the question, how can it be expanded? I find it fascinating that I've not yet heard a lot in our discussions today the role of autonomous vehicles. It's something that in other circles and forums that I've been in dominates the conversation. In fact, there is not 5 minutes that goes by that those two words are not yet mentioned. And I think as we're thinking about the opportunities that lay ahead, Vision Zero has to play a very key role in that sector, very specifically by putting people at the forefront of this expansion of autonomous vehicles, of this new industry. And while there's a lot of promise in technology with regards to safety, and I think many of us are looking toward a hopeful eye, I think we have had generations, particularly in the United States, of a car-centered culture. We need to move forward in this next phase with a people-centered culture.
Thank you very much. A really good point about the autonomous vehicles. You do hear it come up a lot, don't you, in all these forums. Moving on, I think Blair, to get your opinion on this, if you were going into a new country, who would you first go and speak to about Vision Zero and to try and get it implemented and adopted by a country?
Look, it is a good question. And so just to give you context, in Australia, we've had Vision Zero safe systems for 15 years now. And the first 10 years really was conversations and debates and translations, not literally off the Swedish to English, but more about the, how do we apply it in the Australian context. And I think we're all congratulating ourselves that we were now a safe system, but nothing happened, nothing changed. And it's really only been the last 4 or 5 years really where I think we've started to see a major change and a better, deeper understanding of what's actually required. And that's happening at all levels. It's not cities, it's not state or federal government, it's not corporates, it's all of those things. So safe system, is a shared responsibility and everyone's got a role to play. So a lot of it is around just trying to establish in your role what you can do to make sure it's moving forward. So we don't actually have Vision Zero cities in Australia yet, and I think we should. We're moving into that direction, I think. We've got some safe system local governments, but really they're, again, theoretical discussions and not moving forward greatly. We're seeing a lot of progress now, though. We're seeing, I think, with the development of new tools, development of performance setting, as I mentioned earlier, performance targets for all organisations. We're seeing sort of a movement in this direction. And in terms of corporates, we're seeing a lot of activity there. They, in fact, opposite to the Swedish example there that we just heard about, that our corporate sector have really been Vision Zero focused. And I work in an area where there's a lot of industry, and I see a massive sign in a factory just near to my workplace which says we are Vision Zero, and they have been for a long time in our corporate sector, and they're all about making sure that there's no deaths and injuries in the workplace. So a big part of what we're doing now is actually then translating what they can do around the driving element of their roles. And we've got a whole part of our organisation manages the National Road Safety Partnership Program, which is all about giving advice to corporates about how they can improve safety and how they can actually take Vision Zero forward. And there it's about things like vehicle selection for their employees. 5-star plus vehicles, not just 5-star vehicles, but 5-star plus vehicles going forward. And it's all about route selection and training and the right systems in place for them. So I guess my point is that it's a shared responsibility. Everyone's got a role to play, and there's a need to just really analyse what you're doing within your role and actually establishing the performance metrics going forward to get to that zero.
Thanks a lot. Ben, can you add your thoughts to the issue?
Who we should go to first? or I mean, who you would go to first? Okay. Well, I think events like this are the way to do it. It's not any one person or one stakeholder. You have to, the whole point of Safe System is that it's coordinated across sectors, and including sectors like oftentimes that we see the infrastructure folks that are not part of the conversation on advancing road safety. So one thing that we've seen, and Veronica, you can probably speak more to this, the Vision Zero Network has a great piece out on basically Vision Zero committees and how to set up these committees. In our report too, we talk about the need to have a coordinating body, especially on the city level, when you may not, on the national level, there's a lot of discussion about creating road safety agencies, right? There's been that movement. On the city level, or even the subnational, local, state, provincial level, that may not be as appropriate. I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but you need to have some kind of coordinating mechanism, right? And, getting back to your question of what do we do to get started, I mean, having, convening, getting people together to talk about Vision Zero, or a safe system, or towards zero deaths, or sustainable safety, whatever you want to call it, so that people understand what it is and they can move to that. I think that's a great step. In my home state of Minnesota, we're one of the earlier adopters of Towards Zero Deaths, and they have a regional coordinating, a statewide coordinating committee made up of the DOT, the MnDOT, the Public Safety Department, the Health Department, others, and then they also have regional coordinating policies for each transport district, which also have their own convening events every year. So, and they're tracking their progress towards the target that they've set, right? So I'll stop there, but I think people talking together is probably the first good step.
That's a good point. One other thing I'd like to talk about is how do we bring the public along with us? I know everyone in this room, I think, can agree that Vision Zero is fantastic in lowering speeds, especially where you've got corridors, where you've got pedestrians and cyclists and motorcyclists as well, is a fantastic idea. But we still get a lot of pushback in a lot of projects we do where the public don't buy in. How do we get them involved? I'll open this up to anyone that'd like to answer.
So you're talking about speed. So speed is very difficult to explain for people. It's very difficult for people to understand the risk with kinetic energy. So this is the thing that we really need to talk about, especially among the professionals around the world. People have talked about it today, for example, that if you get hit by a car in 30 kilometers, the risk is less than 10, but if you get hit by a car in 50 kilometers, it's more than 80%. This is really the core essence of Vision Zero. That's the scientific evidence for Vision Zero. But it's extremely difficult for us as individuals to understand that. So that's the challenge, to explain the relation between kinetic energy and the outcome in fatalities and serious injuries. So I don't think that people are crazy or something like that when they are opposed to speed reduction. I think they are very rational because they can't see this, So I think that here is something for us, the whole community. We have to start to talk about kinetic energy. We have to start to talk about controlling for harmful energy. And it's not always about lower the speed. As someone said, you can have almost any speed you want if you have a very safe design of your roads and that sort of thing. So that's the relation, at least there are my experience. When we came through with that kind of thing and we were able to communicate this sort of thing, then people start to realize that this is not up to us as individuals. It's almost as difficult to understand energy as climate change or things like that. So it's a very important for us as experts that we try to start to talk about that.
Thank you. That's a really good point. I'll open it up to that first.
At the Vision Zero Network, we are very clear with cities that want to be Vision Zero cities that they must have an action plan or an implementation plan, but that plan must include public input from the very onset. We are not encouraging cities to put together an action plan and then present it to the public for inputs and feedback and discussion. We are saying you must develop this plan at the very beginning with your community stakeholders, your law enforcement stakeholders, your public health stakeholders, et cetera, and even broader than that. That is one way that we try to be very intentional about incorporating the public from the very beginning into this discussion. And we've talked a good deal about this transformative shift and what Vision Zero is, and Matt talks about it as a policy innovation. And the way that we engage with our public also has to shift. We have to recognize, and we are seeing this more and more, that our community members are experts also. They may not have the level of technical expertise that many of us bring to the conversation, but they bring a level of expertise that we then rely upon. They bring communications expertise that, quite frankly, we in the agencies or departments are not as well versed as our community experts and stakeholders are. They oftentimes bring geographic expertise. They know their corners, they know their neighborhoods, sometimes much better than our engineers. And it's not a criticism, it's just we're talking about blending these different skills. So as we're thinking about engaging on Vision Zero and Complete Streets and these larger, broader discussions on reducing fatalities, we have to be very, very intentional in shifting the way that we incorporate the public at the very, very beginning, not as an afterthought, after we've developed these ideas and plans, and then expect our community members and the public at large to buy into it.
Very good. We're running out of time here. We've got a question coming in from the Caribbean. It's top suggestions to face the issue of getting political support. So many competing priorities. There are so many competing priorities and limited fiscal space. If anyone would like to take that one on.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that, and just actually extends that last conversation really, that I think right now the public doesn't recognise there is a road safety problem, and therefore politicians don't recognise there is a road safety problem. There's a byproduct to transport, which happens to be deaths on the road, and so people don't recognise firstly that there is a problem, and that problem will impact them personally directly, and then thirdly from there that there is a solution to that problem. So by extension, politicians don't know that there is those solutions around. So right now we our friends and families assume that death and injury is part of the public transport, part of the transport system. I think there's now new tools in our toolbox to engage on this, and a lot of social campaigns around making people understand that this is actually a massive societal problem, and that it can impact you personally. And I think Rob demonstrated that really well this morning with bringing it back to the story as well as the science. It's about my kids and my family, and I think we need to do more of that, and then make sure it is a personally understood issue for people. And then the next part, the last part really is also then making it clear that we have the solutions within our reach. We know that we can do the improvements that will eliminate death and serious injury on our networks. It's not going to happen everywhere in the next 2 to 3 years, but if we project forward to 15, 20 years, it's getting very, very close to being feasible. So I think we need to then convince the public and then therefore the politicians that this is all within our grasp.
Thanks a lot. I'm sorry, we're out of time, so if you've got further questions, you're going to have to catch these guys afterwards. But a big round of applause to all our panel members here, and thanks a lot. We're going to have a break now, and then I believe we'll be back this afternoon at 3:30. Thanks a lot. 4 o'clock.
It's our last session of the day before the reception, so get ready. We're going to have a very enriching discussion. I'm going to keep everyone on time, make sure that we have some good questions, and then we'll conclude on time. But my name is Kelly Larson. I am a director at Bloomberg Philanthropies. I direct our global road safety work. So I have the dual privilege of being the moderator of this session and also being the first presenter. So I'm wearing two hats, and I'll present first and then introduce our panelists as they give their presentation. My topic today and our topic is to talk about monitoring and measuring programs for success. And I am going to kick it off with talk about some of the global goals and targets, and then talk more specifically about the work that we're doing at Bloomberg Philanthropies and how we really stress monitoring and measuring the activities that we implement so they can guide our work. And the title of my presentation is in quotes, "If you can't measure it, you can't manage it." That is not my quote. Does anyone know whose quote that is? Margie. Michael Bloomberg. I think that I've said that quote probably every time I give a presentation, and it's something that he says all of the time. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. At Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're all about evaluation and measuring so that we can ensure that we are utilizing our resources effectively and that we're understanding the outcomes so that if we do fall a little short, then we know how to adjust. So I'm going to talk just very briefly about how we measure and manage. But you know, we all know these two numbers, but for us at Bloomberg Philanthropies, they're very important. Road safety or road traffic injuries being the 8th leading cause of death clearly doesn't get the attention it deserves, although everyone in this room, we're doing everything we can in our power to reduce that number, to make sure that that number increases, doesn't decrease, and it has decreased and gone to the 8th leading cause of death from the 9th leading cause of death in the last couple of years. And that's not because of we're not trying, but we just have a lot of work to do. If we follow Mike Bloomberg's quote, "If you can't measure it, you can't manage it," for road safety, we're on the right track. We have a number of different global monitoring platforms and targets that we can all base our work on. And I'm not going to go through these 4, and there were many more, but recognizing that the topic of my presentation is about measuring success, but I think we also need to make sure that we measure failure. That can help us in our work. And I wouldn't say that not meeting our goal of 50% reduction of road traffic fatalities by 2020 is a failure. If you think about it, if we could get all governments to really prioritize road safety, we could meet that goal. Hopefully, we can switch that date, and by 2030, we will realize that goal, but important to continue to measure. Recently, WHO came out with global road safety performance targets. Important also to keep targets in mind as we really look towards the future and what we're trying to achieve through the respective work that all of us in this room and around the world are doing. The global status reports on road safety by WHO are really important to help us monitor over time the state of road safety globally and also by country. We've at Bloomberg Philanthropies have supported the status reports on road safety. We've had a series of 4, with the 4th coming out next month in just a couple of weeks. And that will, I'm not going to give away any of the data, but it will provide us with kind of where we are when it comes to road safety. And then obviously the UN Decade of Action, we didn't meet the goals there either, but we had a framework for which we could focus our efforts. And that it's important that we all have the rallying cry that we recognize what works, use the evidence, and monitor as we go along. So thinking about those global targets and the global goals, at Bloomberg Philanthropies, we see road safety as something that we can set out goals, we can set targets, and we can achieve them. Not always easy. So we have supported road safety over the last 12 years, since 2007, working through a number of international partners who we've heard from many of them this morning and this afternoon. Our strategy is threefold: working at the national level on legislation, working at the city level on implementation of all of those evidence-based approaches that we know that will reduce crashes, injuries, and fatalities, and then also on vehicle safety in 4 regions around the world to really improve safety standards of vehicles throughout low, middle, and high-income countries where needed. So this just gives you a sense of where we're working and where we're actively measuring and monitoring our work. I heard Ben talk today about 86% of deaths in Addis Ababa are pedestrians. Juan Pablo from Bogota talked also about pedestrians and motorcyclists being the highest groups of fatalities in Bogota. So in thinking about the measurement and understanding the data, while we're working globally around the world, we know what works to reduce road traffic fatalities. Our approach is very different, or our priorities are different in the locations that we worked, based on the data that we understand and where fatalities are occurring. We're also working, as I mentioned, at the national level on legislation, where across the board we want to have strengthened road safety legislation. So it was refreshing to see talk also about Fortaleza and a 32% reduction in road traffic fatalities since we've started our work there in 2015. In Addis Ababa, they've done some great work. In Mumbai, they've reduced road traffic fatalities by 20%. And the reason that we know that is because we're constantly measuring the outputs of the work that not only that we at Bloomberg Philanthropies have supported, but also the work generally within the city. I just wanted to talk very briefly about how we measure impact of the programs that we support that will in turn support some of the global targets and the global goals of that I mentioned previously. So we're on a 6-month basis conducting observational studies, really going out into the field and observing the 4 risk factors that we're supporting. That's helmet use, seatbelt use, speed, and drinking and driving. Probably don't need to tell you that. That plays a big part in understanding, well, sure, we're doing hard-hitting media campaigns, or do we have enforcement following up on those media campaigns, and are they actually affecting the risk factors that we're focusing on, and are we seeing an increase or a decrease in those risk factors? We also recognize that the data is not always all that great. So strengthening the surveillance of crashes, injuries, and fatalities so that we can have a better understanding of the who, what, when, where, and why of road traffic fatalities in the locations, in the jurisdictions that we're working, so we can really prioritize our resources. I mentioned previously the WHO Global Status Reports on road safety also play an important part in the measurement of the global efforts. And then we also have undertaking, so we call it the lives saved activities. And so we're really measuring the improvements in road safety based on the observations, based on the infrastructure changes, based on the improvement of high-risk roads, based on vehicle safety standard improvements, and trying to understand how we at Bloomberg Philanthropies are contributing to the goals. And we know that through the work that we supported from 2010 to 2013, we estimate that we'll have saved 125,000 lives. We're currently in the process of, again, assessing the work that we have implemented and hope to have a rolled up number in the next month or two from 2007 to 2018. That in turn will help us as we enter into the last year of our 5-year commitment on how we can enhance our investment on road safety, and will certainly help us in our strategy. So this slide just gives you a sense of the observations that we've collected on helmet wearing in our 10 cities where we're focused. And you'll see that in 4 of the cities, we've had a pretty significant increase in helmet use. Fortaleza, Accra, Mumbai, and Bangkok. And we know for a fact that in 3 of the 4 cities, there has been very strong, hard-hitting media campaigns, as well as increased enforcement on helmet use. We also know that in Mumbai, we've seen a 20% reduction in fatalities. That's not just because of increased helmet use, but partly because of it, as well as in Fortaleza, the 32% reduction, and you've seen a pretty significant increase in helmet use. So that, for us, is demonstrating that the work that we're supporting in those cities, the work that is being spearheaded by the cities, is changing behavior and is affecting certainly the number of lives lost on the city's roads. So measuring impact, we're constantly measuring, constantly monitoring. Mike's always asking, how many lives have we saved? I once had a meeting with him for 45 minutes, maybe 5, 6 years ago, and he's like, how many lives do you think we've saved in the 45 minutes that we've been talking? So it's all about saving lives, and we're constantly trying to look obviously at outcomes, but we recognize that there are process indicators that come along the way. And here I've just listed a few that many of our partners in the cities and countries have implemented over the course of 12 years that we're very proud of the support. And this just shows some of the things that we're constantly updating so that we can demonstrate the work that's being done on road safety. So thank you for your time. My 10 minutes is up. And I'm looking forward to introducing the next speaker, which is Eugenia Rodriguez. She is the advisor for road safety for PAHO. She not only has a medical degree and a master's degree, but she also has a PhD and has numerous years of experience working in Latin America. And I welcome Eugenia.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everybody, for being here at this time. Thank you for the invitation. And so I will talk about the decade of actions and the updates related to the Global Status Report. Unfortunately, our new report will be next week, and so I'm showing the data from the previous one here. I will talk about mainly about the lead agency of who have improved in this region recently, the road safety legislation, and also about the evaluation of our plan of action on road safety from Pan American Health Organization. And so I will show some results and the report, as Kelly was mentioned, so we are presenting the 4th report soon. And so this one that I'm presenting is based on the 2015, and so takes into account that covering 96% of our population. We have most of the countries represented here. And so we also have data from road safety death, and also have data on legislation and some policies, and how have we been working in an intersectoral approach. And so we already talked about that. We have the next week, the next report. And so I'd like to highlight that in the beginning of the decade, so we have just few agencies in the region. Now we have 30 countries that have an advisory committee or an agency responsible for this multi-sectoral coordination. So I have some examples in this slide, so from Chile, from the Costa Rica, from Argentina, from Uruguay, just to mention a few of them. And so that's important progress, and so, but we still need to have more support for these agents. And so I think it's a good step that we move, that we have this coordination, but it's still, we have to support this country, most of this country, for continuing improving. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislation. That's a big issue, and so I choose to begin with the speed that we are talking in the previous panel about the speed. And just to highlight what's the situation in the region. So I'm sure that most of you are familiar with this data because we, let's say, I just would like to highlight that we have 7 countries that have the set maximum urban speed limits equal or under 50 kilometers per hour. And so when we are going to other recommendations of these legislations, we have just 13 countries that allow local authorities to reduce national speed limits. And we have just only 5 countries that meet both criteria for the best practice to have these limits and also to allow local authorities to reduce these limits. And so when we ask about the enforcement, we just have one country that's rated its enforcement of speed laws as good. We ask countries to give in a rank from 1 to 10, just one country gave 8. That's we consider a very good practices. And so what I'd like to highlight here, so we have pushing for this legislation, but we have a lot of resistance to have this approval. And so recently, we have a good news that's not present here, but a good news came from Chile 3 or 4 months ago, that Chile approved also this limit, the urban limit for 50 kilometers per hour. And so it's a big change in the countries, and we already have some previous data that show that we have a decrease on number of deaths. And so now the other legislation that we were pushing is drink and drive. And so when we're going to see the number of countries in the region that set this limit of 0.05 grams per deciliters for general population, in a little, the other limits for young and novice drivers, that's just less than 0.02. And so we have just only 6 countries in the region that accomplish of this recommendation. So it's obvious that's a lot of work to be done, to continue to be done, and hope that next report we can show better data. Looking for it. And so, and also when we talk about enforcement, we have just only 4 countries that rate this drink and drive enforcement as good. And so, as you remember this morning, Dr. Hennis from PAHO as well, it told you that it's how difficult we have to make enforcement in most of our countries, because some countries in Caribbean region, for instance, is related to tourism, and so they don't want to have this kind of enforcement. It's not good for tourism, so it's a lot of work to be done to improve this enforcement. So. And when we talk about motorcycle helmets, we have only 10 countries that accomplish also this, all the best practice that we consider. And we have just 16 countries that require helmets that met national and the international standards. And also only 7 meet both criteria to have this enforcement, to have the national standards, and so to require that the use of all motorcycle users and in all roads. And the enforcement, it's a little bit better when you talk about helmets, and so just comparing to the previous one, all the countries relate the enforcement as good. But just to remember, that's a big challenge in the region, the increased number of motorcycle users. No, that's one of our big challenges nowadays. And seat belts, it's better, the situation, when we talk about the seat belts. And so we have 29 countries that accomplish our recommendations, and the only 19 accomplish with the best practices, and so only 10 countries rated as a good enforcement. And so, although it's something more, I would say, less acceptable when you talk about the increased use of seat belts than when you talk about speed and drinking drive, we still have a lot of room to improve our enforcement, also our legislation. And children restraint laws in Latin America, we have only 13 countries that have this legislation. And the enforcement of this law is weak across the region, with only 2 countries rating. So it's very easy if you go around the region, and so I have some colleagues here from other countries, it's easier to see children in the front cities, and so that's not very well using these children restraints. And so we are working in the region to push for health professionals to put in the health primary care agenda to increase in this use of children restraints, and to better the transportation of children, not only in the car, but call the attention also, because we have a lot of children in the region that are being transported by motorcycle. And so we are trying to push this agenda and call the attention for the big risk this represents also. And here it's a kind of summary of what I'm saying. And so just to highlight, and so in the last line, we have South America, we have the best. When you're comparing the application of the legislation, the best region that making better is South America. And so we have a lot of room to improve in Caribbean, English-speaking countries that we have more challenge there to improve legislation. And so this presentation will be available, and can go to this detail later. And so here, just briefly, this is our plan of action on road safety that after the decade was approved, we approved also a plan of action in PAHO. And we have the final evaluation, a final report that we presented recently in September in our direct council. And so it's a lot of details, and so I will leave the link for you, and so you can go for the report and can see the details. It's a kind of a comprehensive analysis about what's going on the decade. I talk about the legislation, but we also analyze what is going on the policies that investment of policy in public transportation, infrastructure, and the quality of data on mortality, on morbidity. That's an important issue that Kelly mentioned, and so to improve the data quality, and so on. And so for conclusion, so progress made in the region, development and designation of lead agents, legislation on drink and drive, and children restraint, implementation of measures to improve infrastructure was improved. We have better data now from when you talk about the mortality and morbidity. And as I mentioned, improve is needed in the legislation and to enforcement. And also to develop of national policies to promote walking and cycling and vehicle inspection and review system. And so here are the link for both of the documents that I mentioned. So I invite you to go in more details what I talked today. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll get those updated numbers next week with the release of the 2018 status report. Next up, I have the privilege of introducing Soames Job, who is the lead of the Global Road Safety Facility of the World Bank. Soames has worked in more than 60 countries around the world on road safety, and I would say he's very passionate about road safety and especially passionate about speed. So I know you're not going to talk necessarily about speed reduction, but welcome, Soames.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you. Talk about reinvigorating the planning and tracking of global road safety. A brief outline, I'm going to cover the size of the problem. I think we need to note, as this decade gradually draws to a close, we have a year and a bit to go, and we know we're not going to meet the target, barring some miracle, but actually it's not barring some miracle, it's barring some global catastrophe. So when we come to the end of this as a communications exercise, we need to be acknowledging not just what we've done well, but what we haven't done well and where we need to improve if we're going to get another decade, and we should be pushing very hard for another decade. So in that vein, I want to talk about where we can improve in terms of planning and where we can improve in terms of tracking. So this is my take, and it's really from the WHO numbers plus an estimate based on the commentaries we've heard. If we look at the way the number of deaths has increased according to the status reports and taking a reasonable estimate of what it's going to be for 2016, and we simply extrapolate that increase, and we take the years 2018 to 2030, we will see nearly 22 million deaths and 875 million injuries on the world's roads, i.e. we have a problem of the scale of a world war, literally the scale of a world war. But we are not addressing it we are not funding that problem as though it were of that dimension at all. And that's a fundamental part of our inability to meet the global plan and the targets of the global plan so far, that we simply are not getting the resourcing, and we won't get road safety for free. I think it's really worth noting that that is the business as usual outcome. That's not the do nothing outcome. If we do nothing, it'll be a lot worse than that. That's if we keep doing what we're doing now. That's what we will see. So the scale of the problem is catastrophic. So what do we need to do? What do we need to change? And I think we can see that there are actually some basic changes needed. We do need stronger national level commitment and funding. Ultimately, there is funding in the Inter-American Development Bank, there's funding in the World Bank, there's funding in all of the banks, but not enough for this. We need a fundamental change of commitment at the national level as well as at the city level. We also, I think, need to move past the commonly chosen weak actions that people want to start with. We need the courage to say, no, that's actually pretty ineffective. It's cute, it's cheap, it's popular, but it won't save lives. So we need to push very hard, and we need to take the courage to push back on that which is popular, for that which will work. And I think we need to change our global leadership. I think our global leadership needs to increase its push on the above matters and needs to increase the push for substantial global funding to meet the target. And to do that, I think we need to clean our own house. And that means, I think, improved planning, improved advocacy, and improved tracking. So, to show what I believe is fundamentally needed as a change, this is the way I believe we're proceeding in the current decade. We have a global target, which has been set within a plan, and then another global target set within the UN SDGs, and we have a global plan. But those two items, as you'll note, are completely disconnected. For all we know, you could deliver the entire global plan and not meet the target. Or you could deliver 50% of the global plan and meet the target. That relationship remains glaringly unestablished. The global plan then often influences many national plans and city plans and state plans and targets, and those things influence delivery. But that's not enough. I suggest we need something which looks like this. No, I don't. These are the limitations. I got these slides out of order in my head. Okay, the global plan and the global target are disconnected. That means our governance to deliver the target is very limited. Our accountability and monitoring are very limited, though I note we have taken some significant steps in the last year to address that part of the problem. We need to go further, but we have taken steps which I'm very pleased to see. And that model, with all of its weaknesses, is very commonly perpetuated in national plans. That is the way we will very commonly see countries develop plans, cities develop plans, states develop plans. They follow this model, including its fundamental flaws. I think we need this. We need to add those two critical red arrows. We need a direct connection between the global target and the global plan. And we need direct connections between the global target and devolving that to national targets. If we cannot achieve that, there is not a lot of use having a global target, frankly, because we're not going to deliver it as a globe, we're going to deliver it as countries. So countries need to own their component of it as their target. And it needs to connect to the global plan. The global plan then needs to connect and be devolved to the national plans. So that means we need these particular details. We need actions which are set to levels required to deliver the target. And this is what I mean. We can't just say, oh, everyone's got to do something about helmet wearing, everyone's got to do something about speeding. We've got to be more brutal. We've got to say, okay, Helmet wearing, we'll just take some hypothetical numbers. Helmet wearing is currently at 30%, and motorcycles are 30% of the deaths. If I got helmet wearing up to 80%, I would save 10% of the deaths. If I'm going to meet a 50% target, I now need to find another 40%. If I get speeds down by 10 kilometres an hour, I will save another 25%. I've now got to find another 15%, and I've got to work like that through to show how the plan with a set outcome to a set level of activity will actually deliver that global target. That fundamental piece is completely absent currently. Then we need to set those actions and devolve those actions very sensitively to countries. It can't be the same for everyone. A country which has 1% of its fleet as motorcycles is going to need a completely different set than a country that has 60% of the deaths on motorcycles. That's the country that's going to needs to focus on the 90% helmet wearing. The other one needs to focus on speed, drink driving, etc. But each of them needs to adopt these actions to an extent which will measurably, if achieved, deliver the target. And then, so that's how we need to change our plan. Then this drives our milestones and our monitoring. Once we've set that, we can set milestones. Okay, if we've got to get ourselves up to 80% helmet wearing in the first 2 years, let's see, we've got to get to 30%, then 50%, then 70%, etc. We then can set milestones from each of those targets, and we can start monitoring performance to those milestones. Now that would be fundamentally good planning, good monitoring, and good governance for global road safety. So this proposed approach adds these benefits. It actually means we would have a plan which, if achieved, will deliver the goal. We don't even have that. It means that we would have a specificity of actions tailored to particular circumstances for countries. It means we would have milestones by which we could monitor progress, and if we're not on track, it means that we can refine and increase the action to achieve that track. If we're meant to be at 40% helmet wearing and we're only at 35, we know we need to do more on that target. We can monitor that performance, and we can use the intermediate outcomes like Kelly was talking about in the Bloomberg program. One of the big advantages of setting these targets by intermediate outcomes is that we can then do our monitoring even in the absence of good data on crashes and deaths, because we can predict all this stuff. We know each 1% reduction in speed will yield a 4% reduction in deaths. We know that if we double the seatbelt wearing rate, we'll save X number of lives, X percentage of lives in vehicle occupants. So we can actually monitor it all if we adopt this plan. Finally, as I mentioned at the start, it means we have a critical communications piece. So when the world says to the road safety community, well, we gave you a decade of action last time and you didn't achieve it, why should we give you another one? Are we simply looking at another failure? We can't say, oh, but we'll do it this time. I'm sure we'll get it right this time. How are you going to do it? Oh, business as usual, same as we did last time. I wouldn't believe that. So if we want to sell that communications piece, we need to show what we as a global community are going to do differently. This is my suggestion for one of the fundamental things we should do differently. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Soames. Next up, we have Mark Juhel, who spent 23 years at the World Bank in the Transport Division. He's currently an independent consultant advising the president of the FIA, as well as the special envoy. So, Mark?
Thanks, Kelly. Well, if you look at the program you initially got, you must have realized that this should have been a gender-balanced presentation, because indeed we prepared it together with Veronica Raffo, senior transport specialist at the World Bank. But Veronica is based in Buenos Aires, and she had to stay down there. She's part of the World Bank team, which is involved in the G20 meeting, which is about to start down there tomorrow also. Therefore, I am alone and by myself. So thanks to my previous role in the bank, I suppose I can still play the part. Right, Soames? Ken? Okay. So we'll try to do that. Now, if you want to picture Veronica on stage, don't look at me. Right. So Road Safety Observatory, why actually first talk about Road Safety Observatory? I want to add another quote to the one Kelly's delivered before from Mike Bloomberg as well. Simple one, which I like very much. In God we trust. Everybody else bring data. That's right? That's right. Okay. So why do we need observatories? Well, to make a long story short, because of that. Because today the difference between the total reported deaths by countries is basically half the WHO assessment of what those deaths actually are. And that's a world average from 600,000 to more than 1.2 million. And actually, I'm afraid the figures coming out in December will be even higher than that, but with significant differences between regions. And as you can see in Africa, basically the number of deaths being assessed by WHO is basically fourfold the reported deaths by countries, little more than twice for Asia. So Africa, Asia are the two regions in the world where the disconnect is the highest indeed, Africa being so far the record bearer, so to speak, on this count. So definitely we need to know better what's happening in countries in terms of road deaths and injuries. So what do we know at the FIA? So FIA Hat right now, what do we put together? We started putting together a number of country profiles, basically consolidating all the information we know about road safety, road fatalities, road crashes in countries. And that's putting information from a number of various databases beside WHO, World Economic Forum, UNECE, the Global Burden of Disease, the e-survey of road user attitude, World Bank, and I must say special thanks to IRAP because we are actually putting a few, 5 right now, information pieces from the IRAP databases. Thanks, Rob. And from what I learned actually yesterday during the Global Technical Committee, there are much more data which is being collected and soon will be made available by IRAP, which I suppose, I'm quite sure, will be able to take also and add to this consolidation. But observatory must be more than data, and that's something I'd like really to insist upon. Observatories are just not a repository of data. They must help turn information into knowledge so that we know data, that's a basic what's happening, which must help lead to an analysis of why are those things happening, and enable policy decision, what to do to correct that. So that indeed observatories become basically the basis for a real policy toolbox for decision makers. And that's a dynamic aspect of observatories, which sometimes is not even underscored, which I believe is critical to make it much more than just a pile of data here somewhere. So what do we need to know? Well, I guess we are what do we know? We need to know, well, we are pretty much aware that we need to have better vital registration system, better healthcare registration system on top of the traditional information we want to collect about the crash data itself, how to make the most of the existing statistical repository, Eurostat, International Transport Forum, UNECE, and the like. But what else do we need to know? Well, we need to know enough in order to track progress on the 2 Sustainable Development Goals, which are specifically targeting road safety among their targets, and of course the 12 universally approved targets specifically on road safety. So we need to get enough information to be able to track and follow progress on all those counts. Road safety needs a multidisciplinary approach. I won't teach you anything about that, but that means that all this intersectoral responsibility must be illustrated in this database so that, indeed, those observatories can provide a platform to catalyze multidisciplinary actions. So that, again, gets back to the need to use the observatory as a much more dynamic tool than just a place where data is basically stored. So performance indicators, I won't go through that. It's just a number of those performance indicators are the ones we want to follow, and a number of them will actually relate to specific policy action in field of traffic management, of car design regulations, in terms of healthcare management, health regulations, a number of things a number of policy decisions which can be actually inferred from the indicators which needs to be collected there. Just an example here also what we can do with following progress. I remember one earlier discussion I had when I was transport manager at the World Bank, discussing with Bloomberg after the first contribution by Bloomberg philanthropies to the GRSF. I went to New York, tried to convince the other Kelly, if I may, Kelly Henning, that she should continue bringing money into the GRSF. And Kelly Henning was telling me, look, that's fine, but after a year or two, we don't see that much progress on road safety. When we finance the campaign against tobacco addiction, we address this much more fast. How come it's so long? And so I tried to make the case. We managed more or less to make the case, since Bloomberg is still involved with the GRSF. But the importance, and that's the point I made there, was to say, well, we cannot go right away from the situation we have to the reduction in deaths and injuries. We need to be able to track intermediate outcomes. And that's in Saul's presentation also, he pointed out that. And one intermediate outcomes here, for instance, is to, well, decrease the underreporting. Well, as observatories are implemented, they should be able, year after year, to decrease the underreporting between what is being collected and actually reported by countries and the global assessment carried out by WHO, also Global Burden and Disease. And that in itself is a progress. We want to have each and possible intermediate outcomes we can identify to nurture the movements, basically, towards the ultimate goal, which is indeed to get a reduction in crashes and a reduction in deaths and injuries. How to improve data collection? Well, there is a number of sensible things to do, but there are also a number of tools today which are available to guide countries into getting that done in an effective way. Systematically collecting data, building experience over time, using the set of indicators which are already pretty well known, but using them the well-defined, standardized definitions. Use the software which do exist today to help categorize and process this data. Use some hardware, some technological developments today which make it much easier to collect data than 10 years ago. All that has to be put together. And of course, there is a number of organizations supporting that. And the development banks, a number of civil society organizations, NGOs can bring. And speaking with FIA, all the FIA clubs actually can participate into this kind of initiative and drive to improve data collection. Let's remember one thing, which I believe is kind of red herring, but still critical to make this work. In all the development bank discussions, there is this idea that we can always help, road safety partners can help, can support, finance initial organization, can help launch an exception phase. But for this to be sustainable, which is another word fashionable those days, country ownership is paramount. So it's a nice thing to say, but I guess it's worth repeating. If the observatory is kind of foreign implant, which has been made a conditionality in a World Bank loan, and it has to be done in order to get the money, and no more than that, it's unlikely to work on the long term. So country ownership needs to be built by nurturing the interest, making people realize how important it is, how by reducing, as we said before, the disconnect between official reports and global assessment, you improve the awareness of not only the decision makers, but everybody in the country that this is something important enough to devote some attention to it in order to get it corrected. Well, that's how you build country ownership. So, how to use the observatories beyond data collection that I mentioned, analysis, policy, and you can, when indeed the wealth of data is sufficient, and again here I just think back to what all the data we discussed yesterday in the Arab Technical Committee meeting. It makes it possible to carry out a number of in-depth analyses. Fatality counts, not fatal, what's the reason, how things happened, what's the part of the infrastructure, what's the part of the behavior, what's the part of the lack of education or lack of enforcement. Bring together all the professionals involved in gathering this data into networks, regional, international networks, which start actually to exist already, so that we keep the pressure on to actually improve what these observatories are bringing. What are we doing at the FIA? Well, at the FIA, under the guidance and leadership of Jean Todt, we set up the high-level panel on road safety, which is bringing a number of CEOs, private sector institutions, international organizations, a number of development banks are there, to try to push the agenda forward. And indeed, we formalized an agreement In Leipzig 2018, we transformed the letter of intent we had with the International Transport Forum and the World Bank into a full-fledged memorandum of understanding, working together on road safety observatories with a number of objectives. And I will say a word right away about what's happening in Latin America and Africa in particular. OSCV, so then I will take my World Bank hat right away. In 2011, actually, the World Bank gave to Argentina the very first standalone road safety project. Well, we lent money to Argentina for the first standalone road safety project, and as part of this project, we helped plant the seeds of what would become the first Latin America Regional Observatory, OSCV, which is in Spanish, so I won't try to tell you what it means, but I'm sure you understand. OSCV is the first regional observatory on road safety there. It was actually set up thanks to a grant from the Global Road Safety Facility, support from the Spanish government, technical cooperation by IRTAD, and so far, well, it has grown into something which just now has been approved as an official road safety program by CEGIB, and CEGIB, I'm sure most of you know, stands for Secretariado General de Asuntos Iberoamericanos. Don't worry, as far as Spanish go, I stop here, but it means it increased the institutional robustness of OSCV. Now it's embedded into the regional institutions, Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's a very strong development. A number of activities are actually developing within OSCV. The World Bank is supporting training arrangement, and the pilot, the driver tool for data collection, and systematic dissemination of the reports now through the ITF, the bank, benchmarking thanks to the e-survey of road attitude, which has been already carried out in a number of Latin American countries, mobilizing the FIA clubs, so that, see, my two hats come together. And the OSCV is working now on this work program, which is there. I won't go into details. You can take a look. But clearly, it's a pretty well already fleshed out plan of action. Then Africa. As you remember, my second slide was documenting how much the gap is, fourfold, basically, between reported death and estimated death in Africa. Well, speaking of mobilizing and nurturing the need for an observatory in Africa, it took several stages to get where we are. During 2018, in Dakar in February, in Abuja in July, and 2 weeks ago in Marrakesh. And 2 weeks ago in Marrakesh, decision was made really to establish the African Road Safety Observatory, ARSO. Bylaws, governance were defined. African Union will actually host the institution in Addis Ababa. 3 working groups have been set up to start putting in place the organization. The ARSO will work actually with other initiatives which were already ongoing, Safer Africa, Euromed, and the WHO will sponsor a workshop during the first half of 2019. Here is the work program that ARSO has started to work on. Again, something solid, a lot of commitments. There will be support at the beginning, and I said we need full country ownership to make sure this initiative will carry forward. In other regions, that's what the FIA is actually doing with the high-level panel. We had discussion with ASEAN countries to try to set up another observatory. Remember, Asia is the other part of the world where the disconnect between reported deaths, assessed deaths is the largest up in Africa. So a first workshop should take place soon, in 2 or 3 months from now. And indeed, the FIA has launched cooperation with the Economic Social Commission of Western Africa, ESCWA, with Euromed. And here we see a picture of Jean Todt receiving an intern, Mrs. Abuenas, in Paris. That's a gender balanced picture, by the way. Don't look at me. Okay. Thank you very much, and drive safely.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. I'm glad you got in Mike's other quote, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. I was considering that for my title slide as well. Last but not least, we have Alejandro Schwedhelm. He is an urban mobility specialist at WRI and has extensive experience in urban planning and road safety around the world. And he also is a professional athlete. He was on the U.S. national canoe and kayak team. So welcome.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you everyone for being here. It's truly an honor to learn from everybody doing cutting-edge work in this wonderful field. So, I'm here to talk to you about road safety indicators, but more than just discussing road safety indicators. Hang on. Sorry about that. Oh, got it. There you go. I'm going to talk about how these indicators fit in the larger context of Vision Zero and policies, and so that we can understand the larger picture and how the different pieces of a safe system can be better understood by knowing where exactly these different types of indicators fall. So to get started, these are the different components of the safe system approach that my colleague Claudia has described earlier today. So when we talk about indicators, we know it is a very critical component of the safe system because and that is the piece that you'll use for monitoring and evaluation to check the pulse and to see how the Vision Zero is going in relation to the end goal of achieving zero deaths. So now I'm just showing you an example of a variety of indicators that we measure as an organization. So this would be a little bit different, but very similar than the indicators that a city would be keeping track of in relation to progress from a Vision Zero program. But I'm listing these just to put them in, to show some examples and put them into context. One main difference here is that final outcomes like life saved or fatalities avoided are things that we try to project based on different risk factors. There is extensive literature on risk factors based on different types of infrastructure interventions. So as part of the Bloomberg Initiative for Global Road Safety, we undertake several infrastructure measures across 10 different cities. And we communicate with our partners and exchange knowledge to know how to figure out how best to measure or to estimate life saved based on different risk factors on this literature. But in the case of Vision Zero and indicators measured at a city level, we're going to discuss this final outcome of life saved as things that we are tracking, so as the current state of road safety. So now I'm going to go into the hierarchy of targets for road safety. This was established first in New Zealand to better understand the institutional framework and cultural aspects that affect how road safety outcomes will turn out. And this will help the different players in the safe system get a grasp on in which layer their indicators fall and in which indicators will fall on the hands of other stakeholders for purposes of better collaboration and better communication when working together to achieve zero deaths. So to start from the top, we have the social costs. That is the outcome resulting from the final outcome. So the larger picture, meaning, for example, the economic situation, reduction of GDP, for example, from traffic fatalities, and other broader public health outcomes. Then when we get down to the final outcome, that will be, under this context, specifically the number of fatalities, and better if you know this information by mode. That is the final outcome and the indicator fatalities that you want to eliminate as the end goal of a Vision Zero program. Then you go down to the intermediate outcomes, which refer to the environment that you set, that's going to set the stage and affect how many traffic fatalities happen. This is the environment that you can influence through infrastructure interventions and through speed calming measures and through speed management programs, setting speed limits. This will be, for example, the observed 85 percentile speeds, and also whether the number of bike lanes that you have in a city, and how safe are your crossings at all the intersections. Those are some examples. Then we're going to go down to the policy output, which is specifically the plans and the programs that will result in laws that will affect the intermediate outcomes and the final outcomes, and subsequently trickle all the way up to the social costs. So that is the key component that will include a comprehensive Vision Zero program. And its success can be measured as it's very difficult to measure as an indicator. It can include, for example, the amount of funding allocated for specific types of programs, and beyond just the number of policies, progressive policies passed, it also means the quality of a Vision Zero program or a plan, whether this plan actually has a comprehensive action plan that is tied to, that assigns responsibilities to different actors and that is tied to a deadline, and that facilitates collaboration that will achieve zero deaths as the final outcome. And then finally, the policy input. In most cases, probably the most important one means the cultural aspects of the location where you're working, of a given city, and how receptive that population will be to certain policies. That could be certain perceptions about driving or about biking or about using different modes. That also includes demographic information. So all of this data, a lot of data that you can attain, for example, from observatories like OSEBI, will help you get a better grasp of this layer, which is fundamental for the purpose of formulating the right policies. And now, to put things into perspective with these sample indicators, I'm going to throw a little bit of magic here and sort of organize them into this, into where they would best fit in this hierarchy of road safety layers. So you have a lot of these interventions or, for example, legislations that are passed or advocated for, or money leveraged towards programs in this policy output. Then you have the intermediate outcomes being a lot of this infrastructure work that we do in WRI. And then ultimately you have the ending result, which is the reduced fatalities or life saved. And then you have the social costs or the point where you want to minimize social costs, which would be translated to increase GDP output or improve public health. And also, very importantly, the cultural aspects that I just mentioned. So mapping all of these indicators under this hierarchy can be a very helpful exercise for stakeholders to collaborate and communicate specifically. That can be a challenge in many large, in cities that have very large and complex institutions. For example, crash data or the outcome or the crashes alone, specifically with good crash data, will be very valuable, will allow you to perhaps do some black spot analysis, figure out where to intervene, but that alone is not going to give you the answer to the root of the problem. So that's where an engineer needs to communicate with the policymakers and make sure where the infrastructure gaps are and what kind of policies will close these gaps successfully. And then most importantly, the policymakers need to truly understand the cultural context in the place where they are formulating these policies so that the outcomes or the positive benefits can trickle all the way up to the top. And then eventually, when a particular city starts to experience the social benefits from a successful Vision Zero program, then that can eventually change the lower layer or the policy input layer as the population can become more receptive for more progressive Vision Zero policies, which eventually will turn into a virtuous cycle that we also describe in our Sustainable and Safe publication, which, by the way, we put a couple copies of this publication in the outside table in case anyone wants to take a copy home. And that should be about it for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro. And thank you to our panelists for your invigorating presentations. So we have a few minutes for questions. I know that it's the end of the day and everyone's looking forward to the reception. But let's make sure that we have one question for each of the panelists. I have some questions, but want to open it up to you first to see if you have any specific questions for our panelists. Now, let's not everyone jump up at once. Go ahead, Rob.
Excellent. Yeah, Rob McInerney. Question for Soames. The idea of sort of trying to predict the benefits that will come from all pillars of the SAFE system, if you like, and their contribution to the 2030 targets. From an IRAP perspective, we've forecast in our Vaccines for Roads resource that we've made available worldwide, how many lives could be saved if we reach 75% of travel on 3-star or better roads by 2030? And that's around 467,000 lives saved, or 37% death reduction. And that will come from the combination of infrastructure investment and the speed reductions that will both combine to deliver that sort of target. So we've got those figures available from an infrastructure projection, and I'm just wondering, like, the other elements of SAFE system, seat belts, drink driving and others, and perhaps Kelly, you might have some inputs here from the Bloomberg Biggers work as well, have we got that data in those other sectors to be able to bring it all together and paint that total picture of how you could optimise between all of the pillars to get there, and where are the gaps, if there are gaps in some of those pillars of how they'll contribute to a 2030 target?
Thank you, Rob. It's a great question with really practical implications. I'm very aware of the work that IRAP has on how changing the roads and reducing the speeds can achieve a very significant proportion of the reduction. That's if we can manage to get to 75%. And I'm not sure we can in the decade, but it's certainly something we should be pushing very hard as one of the fundamental elements of this kind of plan. And I think that the value of IRAP having done that and the value of this kind of approach is that we really do need to think more broadly across the pillars. I think we all say safe system, but actually a great deal of our thinking is still behavioural, and a great deal of what we're measuring is still behavioural rather than these more fundamental elements. So to give you specific answers, I think essentially the answer is yes, the numbers are there. So we know the numbers for speed, 1% reduction in speed, 4% reduction in deaths. Now that number holds very stably on rural, high-speed highway roads. There's a little bit of debate in cities, so maybe it's a little bit different from that in cities. We know the same for seatbelts. We know wearing a seatbelt versus not wearing a seatbelt will change your chance of survival in a typical serious crash by a particular percentage. I'm going to put a caveat on all of these at the end. We know the same for motorcycle helmets, but not quite as precisely. The things we don't know are the caveats are this. First of all, there are overlaps, and we've got to manage the overlaps. So if we treat all of these separately, we'll save the same life 3 times. You know, if we reduce the speed and get someone wearing a seatbelt and that person doesn't die, you've still only saved one person, even if either of those alone could have saved them. So the first caveat is we need to manage those overlaps. The second caveat is the exact applicability of it. And I think this statement's true for IRAP and for the vehicle safety stuff. So, for example, the New Car Assessment Program estimates that each increase in STAR is about a 10% increase in survival. So if you go from 2-star to 4-star, you've got a 20+% increase in chance of survival. So those numbers are all there. What we need to be careful of is exactly how applicable are they. So let's take that NCAP number, the last one. All of the data on that are from high-income countries. Now, maybe if we go to low-income countries where you're starting with an even poorer vehicle or you're starting with more dangerous infrastructure, that 10% might be 9%, or it might actually be 11%. So there are some caveats around how precisely we can do it, but I think we have enough numbers to get very, very close. And I think if we said, okay, this plan will deliver us 50%, it will deliver us somewhere between 45 and 55%. I think we could get that close because the numbers exist for each of these elements. There are some elements where it's not quite as precise, but I actually think to develop a plan to get 50%, we wouldn't need to go to those elements because as you've pointed out, if we reduce the speeds and we do the roadworks you're talking about, we're already getting, 1/3 or so of the deaths. And if we dramatically increased helmet wearing and seatbelts and reduced speeds more and did a few other things, we'd get that 50%.
Soames, maybe wrap it up in 30 seconds.
In 8 or 10 actions. I don't think we need to go to the actions where we're less precise on the data.
Thank you so much for that. So Eugenia, can you talk a little bit about the concern of motorcycles in Latin America and what's being done to really address the increase in motorcycle use?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Kelly. I think we don't have the right answer. We just have this kind of increasing number of motorcycle death among motorcycle users, more and more. Each year, in some country in the region, I would say Dominican Republic, Paraguay, we have less than half of all the road traffic injuries deaths are related to the motorcycle users. And so we are trying to push for public transportation policies. I think it's clear for some studies that we are doing in the region that when we ask about for the motorcycle user why they are using motorcycle, and sometimes it's more cheap to go for working, for the day-by-day activities on motorcycle. And so we are talking about transportation for the schools, and so safe ways to go to school, but sometimes in some communities you don't have transportation for the schools. And so I would say we see at this point more problem to be deal with some solutions. I think the solutions come together with these colleagues that are here. When we talk about the roads, better roads, etc., I think better vehicles, we also should consider motorcycle. And so I think we talk a lot of more and more about cars, but we could also talking about the safety for motorcycles itself as a vehicle and trying to have better infrastructure for this vehicle and push for policy. And so I think that we have more gaps than solution at this point.
Okay. Thank you for that. So we do have an online question asking about autonomous vehicles in the Vision Zero approach. Technology advocates are arguing that, with autonomous vehicles, no one will be drinking and driving. Traffic rules will be followed. So are there any thoughts on how autonomous vehicles from the panelists will help reduce road traffic fatalities? Yeah, Alejandro, and then Mark.
One thing that we've discussed in very interesting and engaging discussions within our group is that autonomy will not alone solve traffic injuries. And there's one interesting book, I think it's called The Three Revolutions, that mentions that that transport sustainability, and within that, accidents are included, will not be achieved with just autonomy, but also with sharing the vehicles to reduce the number of automobiles on the roads, and also electrification to reduce pollution. And among those three, I think the sharing component will be particularly important because there will be less vehicles in the roads, substantially.
Mark? Thank you, Alejandro.
Yes, actually, this is the point on whether autonomous vehicles will lead to improved safety across the board was part of a discussion we had at the ITF last May in Leipzig. And if we look from a developing country perspective, we are a number of us seeing challenges there. Because in an optimal situation for the autonomous vehicle to deliver all of its expected benefits, the vehicle and the infrastructure need to exchange information and data on a continuous basis as the autonomous vehicle travels. Well, if you look at the state of infrastructure in many developing countries and the large heterogeneity of traffic there with extremely different road users of all kinds being mixed with limited protection, there is a risk that in the first stage, introducing autonomous vehicle without first taking some caution to make sure that they are introduced in a way which will actually not lead to more conflicts or more risky situations by putting together users and infrastructure which are not at all adjusted for that. That may be another part of the problem, which so far has somehow been overlooked because we are jumping forward to an ideal situation where basically the machine does things better, possibly. Also, even we have had a couple of instances showing that we are not yet there totally. But from, again, a developing country perspective, it needs to be thought through how introducing those vehicles should be done in a way which will not create an additional risk environment during at least first initial period. Even if it's a longer term, yes, we can be optimistic and hope it will help.
Great, thank you. Sure.
I think the other really important caveat to put on this is I'm a believer in this technology. I think it's going to help road safety in the long run. So I think Mark's right about Europe, but then if we think about Africa and the places, the lower and middle income countries where we have 90% of the deaths, lots of those countries have a vehicle fleet which averages 20 years old. So if these vehicles start rolling off the production line in 10 years' time, maybe an optimistic figure, and then they're typically brought into these countries when they're 10-year-old vehicles, that's 20 years. These vehicles are 20 and 30 years old before they're replaced. It's not going to be within throwing distance of a 2030 deadline that these vehicles will contribute at all. I think we need to be very careful not to be too optimistic that this technology is just around the corner. We need to keep doing everything else. This technology is a long way off for the 90% of the deaths in the low and middle income countries.
And we know what works to really bring down fatalities in these countries, and
right.
Let's focus on what we know.
Exactly, yeah.
So we have one last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you. I might be an odd woman out, well, along with Patricia, actually. We come from Google Maps and Earth and Street View, and looking at the shorter term, maybe not the long term, what do you see as the role of technology in helping with decision making, whether it be at the policy level or maybe even the individual level to start deciding to share rides or, yeah, that's my question.
Wow. Well, maybe I'll jump in since
Sure.
I've got something to say and everyone else can collect their thoughts and say something different. I'm not a great believer in the shared private vehicle. I think that the evidence is showing that in some cases you get more travel because you've got more dead time of that person driving around to collect the next ride. I think we should preferably be focusing on mass transit. So I think if we're looking for good technological solutions, it's the best developed, best speed managed bus rapid transit system. That is far more efficient, far more fuel efficient, far less greenhouse gases, and actually putting people in the big vehicle in its own dedicated lane is a much safer option than having people in much smaller vehicles, or even worse, in moto taxis, where people are doing taxi rides on motorcycles and the person riding won't wear the helmet because it smells because 50 other people had it on. So there are all kinds of challenges with this, and I think sometimes the solutions are just best technology for that kind of mass transit. That's what I would advocate.
There is also sometimes some kind of perverse incentive in technology. Since we just spoke of individual vehicles, if we come to the point where it's indeed easily available to have small autonomous vehicles, you could see something which has started happening actually to some extent with a new form of individual mobility, which is people are being driven away from public transport to actually use these individual forms of mobility and then contributing to added congestion. So that's how to, well, in democratic societies, you just cannot decide who can afford or who can be authorized to do things. You offer a menu of options, you offer incentives for people to make the right choices. And at the FIA, indeed, we certainly want to preserve the freedom of choice of the user, but the user must be offered a panel of choice and incentives which will hopefully guide him towards a more effective solution, which is not always rightly provided by technology.
Any other? Sure. Alejandro?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a hard one to answer, but I think one very important technology that will continue to improve substantially is the development of open source technologies for data collection. We already have some really good examples of such, but I think as technology evolves, these technologies will be able to collect higher quality data at a rate that is faster than the rate that any private organization can collect. And having this data open will really allow us to understand mobility at a deeper level, I think.
I just would like to add this technology can also be helpful for enforcement. When we talk about speed, there's a big problem in this field. I'd say that more and more you have to provide technology available for our countries and take into account these inequities that we have, that most of the deaths are in the low and the middle income countries. And so to provide technology for speed control, I think it's another opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you for the engaging questions. And thank you to our hosts for having us here today. I think it's been a very productive first day. And just thanks for the opportunity to be a part of it. So have a good rest of your night.
I also wanted to mention that the reception is in another building, so we'll collect our things and meet at the elevators, and we can all move together to the reception, maybe in 5 minutes. Thank you.